Welcome to all. My name is Zan Karn. I'm an associate professor of history at Colgate University. I'm also serving now as the convener for the Historical Dialogues, Justice and Memory Network. I want to welcome everyone to what is the fourth installment of our network seminar series. I'm pleased to see everyone in the room today. I'm especially pleased that I will not have to moderate today's event, as it's quite early for me. So I'll be happy to take a back seat. But before I hand things over, I'd just like to say a few quick words. First, about our network. You can find the Historical Dialogues Network online. Historicaldialogues.org is the URL. And what you'll find at the website is an overview of the network and also the chance to subscribe to our biweekly newsletter, the chance to see our book review series, the chance to see recordings of previous seminars, and also you'll see there a call for proposals for the next network conference, which takes place in June next year from the 25th to the 28th in Vienna. And in a few minutes, I'll put the URL to the call up in the chat so that you might have a look. I just have one other quick remark before I hand things over. I wanted to say today, for what it's worth, that the network extends its concern and solidarity to all innocent parties caught in the crossfire of conflict. I think most of us would agree that we must do better than a world where might makes right. I won't introduce all of today's panelists, but I'll instead introduce today's moderator. Mary McCarthy is professor of political science. She teaches numerous courses on the politics and international relations of Japan, China, and East Asia, as well as courses in world and comparative politics. She received her BA and PhD from Columbia University, the BA in East Asian Studies, the PhD in Political Science. Dr. McCarthy specializes in Japan's domestic and foreign policies. She's published on topics including the Japanese media and cooperation and conflict between Japan and China in the East China Sea. Her current research examines the historical legacies of the Asia-Pacific War on Japan-US, Japan-China, and Japan-Korea relations. She's also a Mansfield Foundation US-Japan Network for the Future Scholar. Dr. McCarthy, if you'd like to take over, I'll turn off my screen.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I want to welcome all of our audience members today for this very exciting panel event. And my thanks especially go out to our three speakers who were kind enough to invite me to moderate this event. I wanted to say a few words in opening about my relationship with two of the speakers in particular, Sachi and Kevin, with whom I have been working on a special journal issue called Knowledge Production and Activism on the Comfort Women in Northeast and Southeast Asia. So in that special issue, we cover new research that look at countries across Northeast and Southeast Asia, from Taiwan to Malaysia to Singapore to Indonesia, China, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, the Philippines. And that special issue should be coming out early next year. So if you are not already on my mailing list and would be interested in learning when the special issue comes out, I do ask that you send me an email and you will get right on that mailing list. So I just wanted to share that information with you. But today we are here for an exploration of three really momentous, excellent new books on the Comfort Women. We will be looking at and exploring Kevin Blackburn's The Comfort Women of Singapore in History and Memory, Katharine McGregor's Systemic Silencing, Activism, Memory, and Sexual Violence in Indonesia, and Sachiyo Tsukamoto's The Politics of Trauma and Integrity, Stories of Japanese Comfort Women. All of these books have come out in the past year and all really exhibit some of the best in new research, important new threads in the scholarship on the comfort women. So I wanted to just spend a few minutes talking about our plan for this morning for our panel event. So we are, first of all, I wanted to remind you that this event is being recorded and you will receive a link after the event for if you want to review anything we talked about here, or if you want to share this link with others. And if you do not want to be recorded, make sure to keep your camera off, of course. So our plan for the event is to start off. I just want to say a few words about each of our authors and draw out some of the common themes that really bring these three books together. Talking a little bit, drawing out some of what I have noticed looking through, reading through each of the books. We're then going to move on to some general questions that I'm going to pose to each of our authors. And then, so that this is a real dialogue and discussion, which is what we aim for this time together, the authors are going to ask each other a few questions. We're going to have about 25 minutes at the end for audience questions of the authors, a little bit of Q&A. And what I ask for you for the Q&A, our audience members, is that you put your questions into the chat, that you write them into the chat. And then anytime during the event, you can put them into the chat. I'll be moderating the chat, and then I'll be drawing out some of those questions to pose to our authors so that we can cover as much as we can. I'll be grouping some of them together, so please do use that chat. We also ask that you keep your microphones on mute, just so that we don't hear background noise and so that we can really focus on our authors. I was going to say this morning. It is this morning for me, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are joining us from. So I wanted to start by saying a few words about each of our authors. And I wanted to start with Kevin Blackburn, who is an historian, associate professor in history at the National Institute of Education at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. His work covers the themes of war, memory, and the nation, oral history and heritage, as well as the history of education. Kate McGregor is a historian of Indonesia. Her research interests include Indonesian historiography, memories of violence, the Indonesian military, Islam and identity in Indonesia, and historical international linkages between Indonesia and the world. Sachiyo Tsukamoto is an honorary associate lecturer at the University of Newcastle in Australia. She previously worked with Alpha Education in Toronto, Canada, on the development of its future Asia-Pacific Peace Museum. And she specializes in gender, war memory, history and trauma, and sexual violence in Asia. So I am so pleased to join with these three really wonderful scholars in this area of war, memory, Southeast and Northeast Asia. So reading through these three really wonderful books, one of the themes that jumped out at me and really brings our scholarship on the comfort women together is this notion of silence. And there are multifaceted ways in which silence comes to bear in both the issue area of the comfort women and scholarship on the comfort women. And I'm just going to touch on a few of them here, but I could write an entire essay on the way in which silence is really manifested in these three works of scholarship. But we have the silence of the women themselves after the war, the silence and silencing by their communities, whether the communities were the local communities, the nation, or the state. There was also the choice of certain women to remain silent because of the social and political contexts in which they found themselves after the end of the war. And there is the silence of the academic community, academic scholarship on the particular stories that our three authors uncover through their books. Because each of these books covers areas of scholarship that we have not seen extensively covered, even as there has been this growing transnational movement, even for historical justice for the comfort women, even as there has been this growing scholarship on the comfort women. Each of these authors uncover new stories and help us to more deeply understand the way in which the comfort system existed, the way in which the existence of these women were shaped by this system that was very much entrenched in gendered infrastructures, and the way in which these women existed in their social and political environments after the end of the war. Each of these authors covers the comfort stations, the existence of the comfort stations themselves, and shares some of the experiences and the lived realities of these women in the comfort stations. And this is not a small achievement that these authors accomplish, especially in the current age when we see right-wing forces throughout the world denying these historical facts. So the fact that each of our authors unearth and uncover the existence of these comfort stations, the lived experiences of these women in the comfort stations, is something that is really important. The importance of these books is multifaceted. Not only do we see an uncovering of these historical facts, this sharing of these lived experiences of these women, they span this long period of time from the 1930s, 1940s, through the post-war experiences, and then delve into the reasons for silence. And I think that this is also so important to emphasize, that we see the influences, the gendered infrastructures, the social and political contexts, but also the choices that women made and why they made these choices to be silent at times. So we see in these three books, starting with our Kevin Blackburn's The Comfort Women of Singapore in History and Memory. The diversity of women who were caught up in this system and how that diversity, both during the war and after the war, led to their unique experiences with the transnational movement and with the decisions they made to speak up or not speak up. We see in Katharine McGregor's Systemic Silencing, Activism, Memory, and Sexual Violence in Indonesia, the struggles that women went through, choosing whether or not to speak up, when they were supported by social and political contexts and actors, and when they were not. And we see Sachiyo Tsukamoto's The Politics of Trauma and Integrity, Stories of Japanese Comfort Women, and her delving into the personal life stories of two women in particular, and how they processed their personal histories of trauma in, again, this context of these gendered structures, a social and political environment that wanted them to stay silent. So I want us to move quickly to why you are really here, and that is to hear from our authors. And so I want to start with a question that really opens it up to each of our authors to explore what they are bringing to the historiography of this area of scholarship and what is new in their findings. So I'm going to start, if I may, by addressing this question to Kevin, if you want to start us off. And each of our authors has 3 minutes to explore the historiography of your scholarship and what's new in your findings. So, Kevin.
Okay, thanks, Mary. I'll just start off by giving some context for the Comfort Women of Singapore. Okay, so for the book, I decided that I wanted to do two things. One was prove the existence of local comfort women in Singapore. When the lists of comfort women are generated, actually, Singapore women never appear. They always have lists of comfort stations, and Singapore appears there. But in terms of histories of comfort women, we have Korean women, Japanese women, Philippine women, Indonesian women. But Singapore is one of a handful of countries where the local comfort women never came forward at all, actually. In the special issue that Mary's doing, we have other countries too like this, particularly Vietnam. There were comfort women in Vietnam, but they never came forward. So one wanted to explain why this was the case and explore their silence. So in documenting the local comfort women, one used the resources that one had here in the archives and the National Library of Singapore, but also across into Japan and other sources that have been generated from Korea and also UK and the USA and Australia. Okay, so the idea was to prove the existence of these women, that local women, Chinese women, Eurasian women, Malay women, and a few number of Indian women as well as captured European women, were sexually enslaved. Okay, so yeah, this was part of the exploration of the lives of the comfort women and what it uncovered in both Malaysia and Singapore, because I've done a comparative article for the special issue on Malaysia and Singapore, is the great deal of diversity in these comfort stations where you have Chinese women who are local women working side by side with Korean women, which is what we don't really hear in many accounts, actually. Japanese memoirs demonstrate this. Japanese veterans' memoirs demonstrate this. And then the silence as well, actually, after the war. The Korean women, the Japanese women go home, but the local women don't go home. Many of them continue in sex work. They become streetwalkers. The younger ones are rounded up by a colonial government that's very indifferent to their fate, and a community that really doesn't want them. So basically, to try and explain this silence was part of the process of writing the book. And you see, a kind of very patriarchal type of, response to these local women. There was very little sympathy at all. And the perception was that they were simply women who had volunteered, despite, abundant evidence that many of the women were actually abducted from their villages and taken to the comfort stations. Other women were coerced. There were many women who were in sex work, actually, who were coerced into the comfort women system by the Japanese military. So what emerges out of the war is a very unfavorable environment for many of these women who were sexually enslaved. And the government attempts to rehabilitate them, in their own words. The colonial government does. And they basically continue in the post-war society, silenced, actually, even through the 1990s. Okay, so I'll just conclude it there, actually. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Hey, can you speak a little bit about the historiography of your scholarship and the new findings that you bring to bear?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mary, and thank you for reading the book. And it's great to be here also with Kevin and Sachi and everyone listening. It's exciting to have a lot of people in the audience, so thanks for coming. So I hope that my book contributes to several fields of historiography. When I think about it, my book has both an empirical dimension, but also a focus on memory. So as an historian, I hope that my work adds to feminist historiography, first of all, regarding what we know about, and indeed, I guess, how we think about the experiences of, the so-called comfort women, particularly in the context of much longer histories of sexual exploitation and inequality. So in my book, I do take a kind of structural approach to understanding the sexual violence carried out by the Japanese military and army, and the conditions that also made that possible in the context of the colony governed by the Dutch at that time. So when the Japanese entered Indonesia in 1942, I argued there was already a colonial patriarchal gender order at work, according to which Indonesian women were already treated as kind of sexually available to Dutch men for exploitation. And these patriarchal structures of power contributed also to the exploitation of girls and women when, for example, local chiefs tried to convince them to go with the Japanese, sometimes with false promises of other work. So there were also local cultures of patriarchy that contributed to this. So the first half of my book sets up this kind of historical context and the conditions also of the occupation and what it was like potentially for women in these conditions. So I'm hoping from an empirical side that my book does contribute to what we know about the system through the detailed attention to the context in which the sexual violence occurred, as well as significant reflection on the context of fear and coercion that Indonesians faced during a military occupation. And the second half of the book, the second kind of major contribution, I guess, is really to focus on the development of activism across Asia from the 1980s to the 2000, really, the end point. So I pay attention there to which factors shaped and facilitated activism, particularly in Japan and Korea, and then the impact in particular of the famous survivor Kim Ha-sun and her 1991 testimony in activating a select number of women to speak out on behalf of the silent majority who chose not to speak, as Mary mentioned before. So I try to analyse also in that context of some comparative transnational reflections why Indonesian activism was slower to develop. And although there's been quite significant scholarship, as Mary mentioned as well, on Korean, but also Japanese activism, there has so far been far less analysis of Indonesian activism and also the very interesting connections between Indonesian and Japanese activists, and also the relationship here to Dutch activism. What my study adds there, I hope, is new insights for scholars, but also for activists, not only from Indonesia, but also outside of Indonesia, about the challenges and barriers that survivor activists and other activists have to negotiate, particularly in relation to sexual violence and in the context also of working across borders. So I hope there it adds to the historiography and broader reflections on how transnational activism works by examining the very interesting and crucial role that Japanese activists actually played in assisting Indonesian activists, particularly Japanese lawyers and feminist activists as well, and how they tried to support and encourage Indonesian survivors. In addition to that, I guess from the perspective of Indonesian historiography, my book is one of the first studies to offer a history of human rights activism. So I hope that it has some important lessons there. And finally, my book's also a contribution, I would say, to what we might describe as kind of histories from below in Indonesia, which is, I hope, a direction that Indonesian history will take up even more, because particularly through looking at this issue, it made me so aware, I guess, that the history of women of particular class, particularly here working class women, is really not that well written yet. And so there hasn't been much attention to groups of women, such as women who work in sex work, but also the so-called comfort women. So I hope the work also contributes to this opening up the histories of kind of more subaltern women, thinking about these women in particular, and also as historians, how can we access these quite difficult histories where there are less written records? It means that we also need to take a very particular approach to, for example, Dutch records of this period, consider them critically as colonial archives, but also to work with the surviving records we have from the women and the importance in that context of activist archives and also of testimonies. So I hope I kept that to 3 minutes. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you so much, Kate. Sachi, if I turn it to you to talk a little bit about what you add to the historiography and the new findings of your work.
Thank you very much for your very lovely introduction, Mary. My research at Japan silenced history about Japan's sexual enslavement system by revealing the constantly traumatized voices of Japanese victims of their own state's violence against its female citizens. The Japanese women were the initial victims of Japan's comfort women system, and as extant literature shows, most of the victims were debt-bond slaves of the state-licensed prostitution system, which was another sexual slavery system in pre-war Japan, and laid the foundation to institutionalize the human trafficking system for the comfort women system. Based on the research of Vaurab Japan and Caroline Noma, my book uncovers the exploitative relationships between the patriarchal state and women as a tool to control men in peacetime and soldiers in wartime through the two sexual slavery systems. The class-based sexual contract between the state, with the emperor on the top of the patriarchal hierarchy as father of the nation, and his male citizen soldiers, perpetuated male sex rights to access female bodies through the two-layered comfort women system provided to officers and enlisted soldiers respectively. My interdisciplinary study of the politics of gendered memory and trauma in identity construction provides new light on the sufferings of victims of sexual violence by uncovering the internal voices of two Japanese silence breakers, Kikumaru and Shirota Suzuko. Kikumaru was allocated only to a few officers, whereas Shirota was provided to numerous enlisted soldiers in the same way as many non-Japanese victims. Their stories of post-war hell tells us the similar endless psychological trauma all victims of sexual enslavement, regardless of nationalities, are suffering in life. Given that both Kate and Kevin suggest the silence of comfort women survivors in Indonesia and Singapore who previously engaged in prostitution, listening to the voices and sharing the sufferings of lifelong trauma victims is critical to restore their justice and dignity. My research also analyzes the complex relationships between comfort women and soldiers as represented by citizen-soldier masculinity and homosocial bonds among soldiers, and the interaction between manhood and humanhood on the battlefield. I hope my book will be a supplementary reading with Kevin's book and Kate's book for a better understanding about silence of victims' voices of trauma, as well as the statecraft to control its people. Thank you.
Listening to our authors speak of their own work is so inspiring to me, and I hope to everyone who is listening, and everyone will run out if you haven't already and gotten these books, because they are such momentous examples of scholarship, new scholarship in this field. So exciting to hear you speak of your own work. One of the other themes that really threads throughout these three pieces of scholarship and is quite evident, I think, in what we just heard from each of our three authors is transnationalism. Transnationalism in terms of the system itself in the 1930s and 1940s, or even prior to that, and also the transnationalism of the movement after the war. So I wanted to ask each of the authors to consider, given this context of transnationalism, why has the transnational movement for redress not had as much impact in these countries or for these particular women who you study? And I thought that we'd break it up a little bit and start with Kate, then move to Sachi, and then to Kevin. So Kate, please.
Okay, thanks for that, Mary. So I'll try and be brief as well. So in my book, as I mentioned before, I tried to take a comparative approach to sort of look at the most well-known case of activism, which is probably Korean activism, but also to consider the context in which that activism evolved, but also to look at Japan, where this issue has also been very important. So I looked at the case of Korea and the enabling conditions, which you could say made it more possible for some women, at least, to speak out. And I argued that that included a democratization movement in which there was greater attention to women's rights, but also new attention to sexual violence, particularly in the context of violence committed by the police actually in Korea, and also the importance of the creation of women's studies programs, which led to new attention to gender and history. I think all of those factors were critically important in Korea, as well as the larger kind of activism related to war redress. And in Japan, if we switch over to Japan, I found some of the most interesting factors in kind of opening up this history included what I mentioned before, new attention to kind of people's histories from below, which made it possible to see new historical subjects. And in addition, the development of feminism, but also critical thinking about Japan's past imperialism, critical interrogation by women of their own complicity in this past. So, and when I turn back to Indonesia in the book and to consider what was not there and how was the context different, of course, Indonesia was still an authoritarian regime at the time this movement began, and Indonesia was also a military-dominated regime. So in that context, it was very difficult for any activism, of course. But in addition to that, I think that there were other factors that affected the recognition of women as victims of violence. Apart from this long-standing military regime, human rights activism, as I said, was difficult, but there was also a repression of the women's movement in general. So very interestingly, Indonesian women on the political left had opened up this history very early, even in the post-war period. But because that movement was repressed in the 1965 repression, I feel that the women's movement took a step backwards and no longer looked at the critical intersection between gender, for example, and militarism. In addition, as I mentioned, I think that the lack of this trend of writing history from below also meant that these women weren't immediately visible as historical subjects. So I think all of those things contributed to difficulties in Indonesia for advancing activism, as well as the lack of development by this stage the movement began of, for example, women's studies. Even though there was some activism to address gender-based violence, this issue wasn't immediately apparent, and it also had to do with more ambiguous Indonesian attitudes towards the Japanese occupation. So thanks, Mary.
Thank you so much, Kate. Sachi.
Thank you. I would like to show two diagrams to answer this question, so just bear with me. Share. Okay. Can you see the diagram?
Yes, we can.
Okay. The success of the transnational redress movement in 1990s was facilitated by the boomerang effect of transnational advocacy networks conceptualized by Keck and Sicking in 1998. The boomerang effect is illustrated in this diagram. In historical areas where the state leads the public to forget, it rejects any challenges from domestic NGOs which promote to incorporate alternative memories into official memory. Transnational advocacy networks bring marginalized domestic NGOs new channels to pressure the state through the international organization and other states in collaboration with international NGOs. However, the victory of boomerang effects such as the Kono Statement and the inclusion of the comfort women issue into Japanese school textbooks in 1990s seriously alarmed the right-wing politicians, intellectuals, and activists. Then a fierce backlash from the state and comfort women denialists emerged. The symbiotic interaction between the state and the denialist NGO is illustrated by the counter-boomerang effect of the transnational revisionist activism. This from above and below coalition encompassed conservative individuals and groups in politics, business, religion, and the media. For example, the leading grassroots organization, Nippon Kaigi, penetrated into every layer of society, including local politics, business, communities, education, and culture for control. Their powerful cooperation has put domestic redress movements into marginalized positions in the domestic mnemonic sphere. More importantly, this comfort women denialist activism has taken advantage of the patriarchal dichotomy of virgin versus prostitutes to evade the state responsibility, as well as Japanese survivors' silence by abusing fragmented stories of some Japanese victims, such as Kikumaru. Kikumaru, in retrospect, said to the journalist Hirota Kazuko that she had the best time in Truck Island, where she worked as a comfort woman. Consequently, Japanese comfort women survivors have never been allowed to be part of Japan's post-war victim identity. As the co-president of Barak Japan, Nishino Rumiko, asserted, until the voices of comfort women victims who are civilian prostitutes are heard and recognized, the issue of comfort women cannot be recognized as a violation of women's human rights. My article on the counter-boomerang effect is published by Memory Study Journals as the special edition in 2022. I will put the link to the chat box later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sachi. Kevin.
Okay. I'd like to look at both Malaysia and Singapore in terms of answering this question about the failure of the redress movement in both countries. There are a couple of crucial things, actually. We have the transnational aspect. There are Japanese feminist historians who come to Singapore and come to Malaysia, and principal of these is Michiko Nakahara. She is crucial in making sure that the comfort women of Malaysia actually do come forward and they participate, in the 2000 trial of Emperor Hirohito over the comfort women issue. Of course, he's long since deceased. But in the case of Singapore, you have mainly the historian Hayashi Hirofumi. He publishes and reveals the comfort women of Singapore and also on Malaysia as well. He's not an activist as much as Nakahara is. But you have Japanese academics, you have Japanese feminists coming to Singapore and coming to Malaysia. But what's perhaps the key factor in the redress movement is actually the local response. You have the activists in political parties, UMNO Youth in Malaysia, and also in the MCA, people like Mustafa Yaakob in the UMNO Youth, and also Michael Chong in the MCA. So these enable, through their efforts, once 1991, the controversy emerges and it becomes an international issue, they start to search for local comfort women. It's it's stymied in both countries, the redress movement. In Malaysia, the Malaysian government, at the urging of the Japanese embassy, simply squashes this attempt to begin the redress movement in Malaysia. In Singapore, the same result occurs, but it's a different thing. The Japanese embassy is not involved. The government itself, basically has kind of neutered civil society for a long time. Civil society in Singapore won't kind of flourish much until the 21st century, but it emerges. You have feminist movements, but they move quite carefully. So the government is not interested at all in this issue. And the local comfort women themselves, prefer to remain silent in a patriarchal society. So what happens is that, the local women, more or less, accept this condition that is forced upon them by the society that had treated them so badly after the war, and they return to live in society, but remain silent. And then in the 1990s, you have a situation where even the founding prime minister of Singapore, who's not prime minister in 1992, Lee Kuan Yew, actually says that it was the Korean women that saved the chastity of local Singapore women, actually, through becoming comfort women. So this kind of suggests that there weren't local comfort women. So the research that's done by some Hirofumi Hayashi is quite crucial here, but the redress movement just doesn't make any traction because the government controls civil society so much. So this contrasts a bit with Malaysia, but the end result is the same, is that the women are silenced. In Singapore, because the government doesn't want this contentious issue in the civil society. And in 2013, when the Korean Council decides to set up a second comfort women statue in Singapore, the government quickly, stymies that as well. It's not at the behest of the Japanese embassy in the case of Singapore. The Singapore government, I feel, basically took this kind of action mainly to control civil society and not let a very contentious issue into civil society, even as late as 2013. In Malaysia's case, that in the 1990s, there's abundant evidence that the Malaysian government intervened to stop its own political activists from pursuing this issue. So the end result has been the same, the lack of traction of the redress movement in these two countries. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin. These are really interesting insights and explanatory factors. I want to turn it over to our panelists who have a few questions for each other. So Kate, will you take it away?
Thanks, Mary. So yes, my question is actually for Kevin. You're back in the spotlight, Kevin. So one of your arguments in the fantastic book that you've written, congratulations, is that Singaporean survivors of the system were repeatedly silenced by larger societal forces, as you've just been explaining there, including masculinist narratives that erase their experience or that cast all women, in inverted commas, as fallen women in need of rehabilitation, as well as negative societal responses when a former sex worker, Ho Kwai Min, actually speaks out. So I just wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit on the consequences of this silencing or women's choice to remain silent, perhaps in terms of broader discussions or an absence of discussions about sexual violence in Singapore. So if you could just contextualize that a little bit more for us.
Yes, this once again focuses on the redress movement as it's kind of ignited, in 1991 by the brave Korean women taking the Japanese government to the court, and it becomes a controversial issue. Yes, in Singapore at that time, you still have the kind of very much a strong patriarchal society. You had the prime minister, Lee Kuan Yew, before, he was no longer prime minister after 1991, but he was quite influential. So even in the 80s, actually, he runs a very patriarchal agenda in terms of, the so-called graduate mothers debate, in a sense that women are moving into the workforce, but because of this, fertility is declining. So you need to bring women back into the home, this type of thing. So you have the emergence of local women's organizations in response to this, particularly Aware, actually. But still in the 1990s, Aware doesn't really take up this issue that much at all. I think Aware, the Singapore feminist organization, has just got so much on its plate that historical issues that are quite controversial, like this one, just get lost in terms of other issues like domestic violence. It took up domestic violence as well. But yeah, it is surprising actually that the feminist organizations, because they're getting stronger, they really don't take up this issue. I think because it is transnational. I think it has transnational implications. It involves Koreans up against Japanese. It is something that the government probably doesn't want, and I think you have broader things that the feminist movement is trying to solve. Domestic violence quite early is put on the agenda. Sexual violence and sex work itself were still topics that even Singapore women's organizations shied away from completely, actually. So you get some discussion, like it's mainly in academic circles. There's always a thesis or whatever about prostitution in Singapore every decade or so, but we don't see it in terms of the kind of intellectual discussion that goes on around women's issues, let alone sexual violence, actually. So I'll just conclude on that. Okay, thanks, Kate.
And Kevin, I think you have a question for.
Oh yes, okay. It's a question to Sachi, actually. Sachi, in your work, you describe the life of the Japanese comfort woman Kikumaru, who in the 1970s tried to gain recognition for a war service, and after experiencing years of stigmatization, this was, but by publicly coming forward, the very act of publicly coming forward, she became even more ostracized. She had her story told in a men's magazine, and she had responded to, presumably an advertisement by a Pacific War Research Group. And so the magazine told her story, but she felt more ostracized after that, in a sense. And she wrote a suicide note when she ended her life, sadly, on the 26th of April, 1972. And the suicide note was to her male editor, the male editor of the magazine that had published her story. She wrote comparing herself to the women who remain silent. The vast majority of comfort women from Japan have remained silent, even though there were so many of them. She penned these words about the women who'd remained silent. She said, "Other women were clever. They were not as stupid as I was." So I'd like to ask two questions from this, because you use it in your book and also your article, the suicide note. Yeah. Okay, what do you think Kikumaru meant when she penned those words? And the second question relates to the silence of the Japanese comfort women. Is her experience a possible explanation why so many Japanese comfort women have remained silent, although their presence at the comfort stations rivaled that of the Koreans at times?
Yeah, thank you very much for such a very important question, Kevin. That is the core point of my book. I need to explain a little bit about Kikumaru's life. Kikumaru was sold to a geisha house by her poor family at the age of 10. After that, the filial daughter Kikumaru turned to a social stigma within her community. When Kikumaru was aged 17, she drew upon the war propaganda expression Okuni no Tame for the country to convince her parents, and became a comfort woman because it was her only chance to escape brutal indentured prostitution. In her post-war life, her sense of pride as a self-sacrificial, dutiful daughter and a loyal national subject rejected the social stigmatization and broke her silence to be publicly recognized as a human being with integrity and dignity. But her trust was betrayed by the society she trusted. Kikumaru concluded in her suicide note that in this inhumane society, rather remaining silent would be smarter. So Kikumaru's narrative of trauma tells two stories. The story of the unbearable nature of prostitution and the story of the unbearable nature of post-war survival. The oscillating nature of trauma between life and death is signified by Kikumaru's voice and silence in the struggle to connect with the inhumane society, which permanently silenced her voice. Again, who had silenced comfort women survivors whether they were good women or bad women, by forcing them to internalize the perpetrator's shame and guilt. They are not only states and denialists, but also us and our communities. Can you imagine the whole picture of countless death behind much fewer survivors of comfort women victims? Many victims were killed or committed suicide during wartime. Silent survivors have not been visible. However, we can imagine the inner voices by listening to courageous silence breakers such as Kikumaru and Shirota. They have told their unspeakable stories of trauma. It is our turn to listen to their testimonies as the listener who can witness and recognize the suffering of all comfort women victim survivors. Kikumaru's story is available as open access in Gender and History Journal, entitled A More Miserable Life Than Living in the Jungle, a Japanese comfort woman story. And Shirota's chapter of my book is also available as open access. So I would like to put this into the chat box. Thank you for the question, Kevin.
Thanks.
Okay, this is my turn to ask Kate. Kate, in your book, you have introduced two Indonesian silence breakers. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce their names properly, but Medium and Tamina?
Mina, yeah.
Mina, Tamina. The comparison between Medium and Tamina as comfort women survivors seems parallel to the contrast between Korean survivors as rape victims and Japanese survivors as professional prostitutes. So to what extent has the 2013 film centered on Tamina's experience changed the public memory and history of comfort women in Indonesia?
Thanks very much, Sasi. So it is important to acknowledge that Indonesian activism continued long after I finished my book, which I finished in the year 2000 in terms of the book's coverage. So yes, you're right. In the book, I open and I indeed end with some reflections on the life of Tamina, who is very important for so many reasons. So she was the first Indonesian woman to speak publicly about her experiences in 1992. And she, like many other women around the world, was inspired by Kim Ha-sun, but also encouraged, interestingly, through her links with a very empathetic Japanese pastor, Koichi Kimura, who lived in Indonesia at that time. So her story is also quite different to that of most survivors who spoke out, because she disclosed that she was a sex worker before being forcibly recruited by the Japanese military. And she offered through an interview with Kimura a very rare first-person account of the conditions of sex work in the late colonial period. And also her experiences had been rounded up and forced into a comfort station once the Japanese arrived. And she interestingly lamented in particular that she could no longer feed her family once she was caught in this system. So in the book, I tried to reflect quite critically on how and why, after she spoke out in 1992, Tamina just seemed to kind of fade from the spotlight. Was it just a question of timing because Indonesian activism hadn't begun in earnest yet? Or was it something else at play? And so I researched the contrasting story of Mariem, you just mentioned, Sashi, who was a 14-year-old girl who was duped into the system and taken far from her home in Java to an outer island of Borneo, and also subjected to not only forced rape, but also a forced abortion. And she came forward after Japanese lawyers had visited Indonesia, and a call was put out for survivors to come forward. And once the lawyer leading this case heard her story, it seemed that a very strategic choice was made that to make Mariem the face of the Indonesian movement because of the fact, I guess, her story was seen as more likely to draw sympathy. So that strategic choice seemed to some extent necessitated by the backlash that you mentioned before, Sashi, which occurred across the world, and began almost as soon as the movement for redress did. So according to those who deny women were harmed, all women in the system, according to those who deny this system, all women in the system were, inverted commas, paid sex workers, and there was no coercion. So in response, activists felt that they had to make choices to promote the stories of particular women, because they knew these women, particularly in the context of ideas about morality, would be more likely to draw public sympathy and perhaps to be considered, more worthy victims. So there is this replication of an idea that you mentioned, Sachi, of who is a worthy victim, which you see, and your argument is why Japanese women were also not recognised as survivors. But that activist focus, I also argue, has the consequences of discounting the forced recruitment and brutal treatment also of women who were formerly sex workers in the system, and it made it less likely that they would come forward for fear of not being seen as a worthy victim. So even the women who were not formerly sex workers also experienced social stigmatization when they came forward. So that attention from a small group of activists to Mina is, in my view, incredibly important. And she continued to receive attention through a grave renovation project, not a monument, but a grave renovation, and also the film that an interesting group of activists in Indonesia made. But again, like the case of Singapore, Indonesian comfort women also had to compete kind of for activist attention, because there were so many other issues that women's activists felt they had to address, in fact, in relation to military state violence against other women, but also migrant workers, other kinds of gender-based violence as well. So thanks for the question.
I want to bring our audience members into the discussion a little more explicitly, and there are a number of really interesting questions that have been posed in the chat. I want to start with one that is probably difficult, maybe the most difficult question. And this is about the attitude of the women's own countries. And the question is there a theory, an explanation out there that can describe the attitude of the women's own countries towards them? So the question asker alludes to Hannah Arendt's idea of banal evil and not thinking, and Zygmunt Bauman's bureaucracy that eradicated morality. So is there some theory that can explain, overarching theory that can explain the attitude towards the women of their own countries? Kate, Kevin, Sachi, do you want, if you want to jump in and try to explain or try to give an idea to kind of engage with that question?
I think I'll start actually, because I'll probably recommend. Yeah, I think this is where comfort women research should go actually, instead of constantly battling these kind of questions that the right wing always suggest, is explaining the silences and moving towards a theory to explain that actually. And when I read Sachi's work, I can see, basically how this is emerging, actually. I think Sachi should be the one that would take this question certainly more than me, actually, because I tend to look at a few factors around this period. And it's really not a theory in terms of what I look at, actually. I look at, basically, the weakness of the feminist movement, the dominance of the patriarchal society, this long history of remaining silent. I as an historian would kind of struggle to actually develop a theory, but I think in the long run this will happen actually, because when I read Sachi's work, she is drawing on the theory of oral history. She's drawing upon the theory of the women's movement and many things that I find quite stimulating actually. So that's my brief response.
So I'll turn it to you, Sachi, then, to engage with this question on theory. And please unmute.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I have brought a lot of different theories from different disciplinary, from history and politics and psychology. But the main theory of my book is sexual contract, proposed by Carol Pateman. And her book, Sexual Contract, is like the Bible of patriarchal in the modern society. And it really, it really illustrates the relationship between men and women in a modern society. The women are properties of men. But she, at the same time, expanded this male-female relationship in the sexual contract, along with the social contract, which provides the freedom and the political freedom and political standing into male. But as the hidden contract, the sexual contract exists for all women in the country, in the modern civil society, as the properties of women, of men. But actually, this is the relationship between the state and women through controlling the sexuality of men. So the relationship between women and the state is the key to understand this very complex issue. So I would recommend to just read the Carol Pateman's Sexual Contract first, and then as a starting point, you can see a lot of, because nowadays, for example, in Japan, we have a very big scandal erupted, and the scandal, the sex scandal in Japanese showbiz, like a Me Too movement in the Japanese version. So the modern type of sexual slavery is just going on, never ends of this issue. So you can expand this core idea to see your own society. You can see a lot of evidence over there. That's my answer.
Kate, anything you want to add to that?
Maybe we should move on to another question. The only general observation that I would just make is that I think that it's very important to look at other contexts of women in war, and this treatment of women who are presumed to have had relations with foreign soldiers is very similar in many different countries. Also in post-war Europe, in other contexts, it's generally all of the shame is placed on the women. So I think that's something important to look at comparatively. And also going back to your point, Mary, that it's very interesting to me that sexual violence is one of the last topics that historians of war have opened up. So there's something going on universally here in terms of opening this issue of sexual violence, but also in terms of the relationship of this topic to ideas about women and where women should be placed, and also ideas about men and masculinity in war. So there's a whole lot going on. That's a very hard question. Yeah, we'll leave it to the future.
It is. And, I think Kevin foresaw our next question, and each of our panelists have sort of started to get into this area, which is future research. And so one of our audience members asked, as many survivors across the Asia-Pacific region pass on, what avenues could academics explore for future research? And we've started to get at this, but if each of you could explore a little bit more about what you think, where should the research go from here?
I'll just briefly start, yes. I think that most of the comfort women have passed away, in a sense, to the extent where interviews with women, I think in the Philippines, it might be a bit different from what I've heard, actually. There are a substantial number of women still alive who are seeking compensation and justice. But from looking at the breadth of time, it seems to be that whatever has been put on the record so far is as much as we can possibly get. There's always other sources too. Like I used a lot of sources that were witness accounts, because there were problems in interviewing the comfort women, because in Singapore they decided not to come forward, even though oral history projects like the ones I've conducted and others would discover them, they would always say no, of course. So this was in the 2010s, but as we move into the 2020s, these women are close to 100 years old, actually. So whatever's been put on the record, and we're getting more stuff from the record too, actually, that, we have, the controversial document that came out of Korea in the 2010s called a brothel manager's diary, actually. And yeah, this, just emerged in 2010. In Singapore and Malaysia, actually, it's the work of the Japanese historians who came here in the 90s that still, has many of these sources, and they've put it onto the Women's Active Museum for Peace, for War and Peace, actually, in Tokyo, actually. So they have this map, that has all the comforts, many of the comfort stations, not all of them, and they have the documentary evidence for it. A lot of this for Singapore, Malaysia comes from the work of two, pioneer historians that I've mentioned before, and they would still have a lot of material. Michiko Nakahara in Malaysia, and Hayashi Hirofumi in Malaysia and Singapore, actually, because what's happened in these two countries is that there are basically a lot of the local material is not, it doesn't seem to be as rich as what they had encountered when they did their work in the 1990s, actually. So, there are local records and they're very good, but the work of these, transnational historians and activists was quite crucial, actually. And so I'll just finish there. Okay.
Sachi, Kate, anything you want to add about what you see as areas for future research?
I'm happy to go while we're waiting for Sachi. I guess having studied the history of activism, I think we should all remember that this is one of the longest running cases of activism, transnational activism in the world. So I think there's also a huge amount to learn about the dynamics of transnational activism. How did it actually work? To what extent can we create, alliances across borders is a really interesting question. And as Kevin mentioned, there is a lot of material available, in Japanese. I had to have a Japanese translator assist me with my work, but it would be great to have more sharing of documents across different contexts. And I'm thinking about, in Indonesian universities, it'd be fantastic if there was more material, but also a really interesting lesson, and maybe especially in the context that Zan referred to that we're living in right now. I think it's really interesting to also look at those lines of solidarity that were possible, given, often when we hear about Japan, then there is this idea that Japan has one view. So I really hoped in my book to also crack that open and look at the cases where there'd been joint activism across borders, and really interesting solidarities and feminist solidarities, and also solidarities that address issues that affect women in daily life, not only in war. So for me, I still think that this topic has so many incredible lines of inquiry. It still continues to fascinate students because I think it's just so multifaceted. So I hope there'll be a lot more research looking at all those things.
I would like to show another diagram, so I would like to share screen. So because of this, comfort women survivors have been passing away every year, and at some point in the future, there will be no comfort women survivors anymore. So what kind of memory and history about comfort women can we keep? It's very important. So this is the circles of memory, the comfort women and the world, created by Professor Carol Gluck in 2021, depicts how the comfort women came into public memory and has transcended geographical and cultural borders, moving around the world as traveling memory. So there are several different phases. This starts from here in 1991 when Kim Hak-sun, the Korean first silence breaker, came forward, and the transnational redress movement started, and then expanded into the paradigm change from prostitutes to the victims of the violence against women. And then the, and then the diaspora community, especially Asian diaspora communities, have started transnational activism and represented by the establishment of the comfort women statue throughout the whole world. And then go to the memory politics. That's the constant confrontation between the two different memories, the revisionist-based memory and the conscient activist memory, which is represented by the prostitutes versus rape victims. And now the memory is expanding global memory. So in the final phase, the memory agents are diverse and the memory of comfort women are traveling around the world. In the same way, the memory of Holocaust is moving around. Describing the memory of comfort women is invoking same or different meanings in different places, such as rape in conflict zones and the present-day trafficking or sexual violence. However, there's no tracing of historical context or even colonial past concerning the experiences of the victims, or even no mentioning to women or Asian. So this is the idea made by Carol Gragg. But so against this backdrop on the global theater of the memory, what is the most important thing? So at the same time, she also emphasizes the significance of our efforts to consider the present sexual violence against women in connection to the past as the comfort women issue and the future. So I think the system itself is very important to be rebuilt more and more. But more importantly, we should listen to the voices of trauma of who have already come forward. So at the same time, it is our task as well, not as the academic, but also the just general public. Thank you.
Thank you all. So it seems clear that there's room for empirical work, local records, and the archives of colonial powers, and theory work out there. And this actually brings us to a question specifically for you, Kevin, which is whether there are any local academic or non-academic organizations in Singapore that maintain current records on local survivors and the memories of comfort women, while collaborating with both the survivors and their descendants.
I think so. You mean in the context of Indonesia? There are some important. Is that what?
This question was for Kevin.
Oh, sorry. I thought you could... Sorry, I heard Katharine.
I'll just be quick and then go to Kate, actually, because I think you can. I touched on this before, actually. I thought I'd answered it before. Actually, there's no. In Singapore, we have a vast archive of oral history. One virtually unparalleled. In the world, actually. It's been collected, since the 1980s, actually. And they have a huge collection on the Japanese occupation, really massive. And people use it from all places in the world because it's put online. The Oral History Center, National Archives decided to put it online. They have hundreds of interviews with people who lived through the Japanese occupation. Not one of them is a comfort woman, actually. But you do get eyewitness testimony from others that describe the lives of comfort women, mainly Korean women and Japanese women, not so much local women, but you do get the sense that women are being taken away forcibly from their villages and their streets, and they're in comfort stations. When I did my own oral research, it was like that as well, in a sense that it was obvious that their sister, their cousin, their neighbor was willing to talk, but usually they would only talk if this woman was dead. They really, if the woman was still alive, they would not talk about these things. So basically, maybe a lot of factors here in terms of possible re-traumatization of through the interview and all this stuff. There are a lot of ethical issues to deal with. But in terms of the sources, I was surprised actually, like the rehabilitation process. One can go to the National Library and read the records there and how that took place. One could. They're not that substantial, but substantial enough to prove that the women were taken off the streets by the colonial government and then put into a girls' training school. So yeah, the sources in Singapore are valuable, but as Kate mentioned before, only if they're connected with those in Japan, which are in Japanese, or those in Korea as well, which are in Korean, and then you've got the North American art records. As well, at Maryland, and then in Australia and in the Imperial War Museum. So I'll just quickly go to Kate, actually. Okay.
Was that question actually for me? Did you want me to talk about records in Indonesia? Is that right, Mary?
Yes, please do. The question was for Kevin, but obviously it relates to your work in Indonesia as well. An important question.
I mean, and also I hope that there'll be more people to work on this. As I mentioned, there is still the key activist Eka Hindra, who became involved in this issue in 1998. when the whole issue of sexual violence in Indonesia was opening up more broadly because of the then recent sexual violence against ethnic Chinese women in the context of riots around the fall of the Suharto regime. So that opened up Pandora's box in terms of opening new conversations about sexual violence in Indonesia. Eka Hindra, a young activist and librarian at that time, did some kind of interview programs on the radio, met Ma Diem, and then became a devoted kind of activist for this cause until this day. So she's been working on this topic for, about 2 decades now, and she has collected a lot of testimonies and also participates in transnational solidarity meetings together with Koichi Kimura, the pastor I mentioned before. So together they've been a kind of key force and continuing collaboration. They also collaborated together to write the memoir of Ma Diem, which is a very important document because it's kind of one of the only more detailed life histories that we have of one survivor in Indonesia. In other cases, it's generally short interviews, some of them conducted by people like Kawata Fumiko from Japan, who came to Indonesia but had to use a translator. So the testimonies are generally a bit partial, and Indonesian Legal Aid, which is the key organization behind activism, also collected fairly short testimonies of women. Some of them are published in a big report, which was given to the Japanese Bar Federation. So, but it would be great if there were longer testimonies. Eka has published a few, and LBH, the Indonesian Legal Aid, lost a lot of their records in a fire. So unfortunately, not everything is still complete. But there are, Ma Diem's story is recognized in Indonesia, and part of her story was also included in some versions of Indonesian history curriculums as well. So that's quite a significant achievement as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to say that our time together is coming to an end because there's so many other issues that we could explore. I'm sorry that I couldn't get to everyone's questions, but I encourage all the audience members to read these 3 fabulous books, this new scholarship on the comfort women issue. And I thank our panelists for being here today and sharing their scholarship with us. So for some final mentions, I will turn it to Zan. I think you have a slide to put up on our screens.
Thank you. I think that Sachi has a slide actually with the adverts for these books and discount codes. While that comes up, I just wanted to take a quick moment to say a thank you to Mary for moderating, also to our panelists and to our guests today. I appreciate your taking the time to spend this seminar moment with us. I want to just remind people before we leave, I'll invite you to visit our network website, explore the site, historicaldialogues.org. And I want to call special attention to the call for proposals, which is up for our next network conference, June 25th through the 28th in Vienna. We'll convene there. The theme of the conference is Travels Beyond the Holocaust, Memorialization, Musealization, and Representation of Atrocities in Global Dialogue. So a theme that I think encompasses all that we discussed and learned today. That call for proposals is up, and the submission deadline is the 1st of December. So I hope you'll consider sharing your work with us there. Many thanks to everyone again, and we'll have some information soon about our next seminar. So thank you very much.
I'd like to add one more thing. We have shown the flyer with a discount code. It is the bonus for everyone. So we will email this flyer to all participants. Thank you very much.
still got a few participants there. I don't know how to stop the recording without ending the meeting. I'm not sure.
I think that you can stop without automatically ejecting everyone.
Okay, the recording, is that what you mean? Oh, just
I believe so, yeah.
Or I can pause it or stop recording. Okay, I'm going to try that, Dan. I don't want to lose it.
It's on me.
All right, okay.